So welcome to the final panel discussion today. Thank you to everyone who stuck around, and especially, we still have people on Zoom, I believe, anyone who stuck around on Zoom for all of this. And the final panel is entitled How the West Wrote Its History of the USSR, and this will be a discussion based on reading Russia and the Soviet Union, How the West Wrote Its History of the USSR, which originally appeared in the Cambridge History of Russia, Volume 3, and was reprinted in a slightly extended form in the first volume of Ron's two historiographical works, Red Flag, Unfurled. And so our panel features two scholars, and I'm going to introduce them one by one as they speak. But first, I'll introduce myself. My name is Alex McConnell. I'm a PhD candidate here in the history department. I'm, as Ron often reminds me, Ron's final graduate student, which I take as a badge of honor and a consequence, not a cause of his retirement. And so it's really a privilege to be here and to have participated in the organization of this, and to also have been present at the first Ron Fest. And this article was not the first piece of Ron's writing that I ever read, but it's probably the one I return to the most often, and the one that's had the most influence on me as a historian and in becoming a Soviet historian, in mapping my understanding of the field. And every time I return to it and read it, including for today's discussion, I find something new in it. So without further ado, let me introduce the first of our two esteemed panelists who is zooming in for us today. David C. Engerman is the Leitner International Interdisciplinary Professor of History at Yale University. He's the author of two outstanding books on the place of Russia and the USSR in American intellectual and political life. And those are Modernization from the Other Shore, American Intellectuals and the Romance of Russian Development from 2003, and Know Your Enemy, The Rise and Fall of America's Soviet Experts from 2009. Professor Engerman has also researched and written on a variety of topics related to the history of development assistance, as seen in his most recent monograph, The Price of Aid, The Economic Cold War in India from 2018, and his current research focuses on the geopolitics of international economic inequality in the second half of the 20th century.
Great, thanks. I'd especially like to thank the whole OrgCom for this event, Val Kivelson, Melanie Talanian, Naira Tumanian, and the graduate students. And of course, special thanks to Ron Suny for giving us the occasion to come together, whether it's in person or virtually. And I think it's really fitting because I always have the impression that Ron likes nothing more than to bring his friends and colleagues together to talk shop and to talk much more. I doubt Ron will remember this, but I actually first met him in the spring of 1988, when Ron, being the mensch that he is, had agreed to serve as an external examiner at his alma mater, Swarthmore, where he was one of 6 scholars who stood between me and my diploma. My preparation for the exam was really basically a short course in social history, more or less a whole seminar organized around Ron Suny's brilliant essay toward the social history of the October Revolution, which has come up already so much today. I confess I don't remember the details of our oral exam, but I do remember quite vividly feeling respected and heard, in a sharp contrast in this way to my other examiners, that in spite of his immense knowledge of Russian history and my glibly ignorant or ignorantly glib opinions, that Ron actually really wanted to know what I had to say, not just because his task was to evaluate me, but because he really wanted to understand how students thought. And based on that slenderest of reads, an undergraduate exam in the late 1980s, and probably a mediocre one at that, Ron was happy to take me under his capacious wings, offering advice, writing letters, like Don Raleigh mentioned, I imagine for many of us here today, and just being generally supportive. I do remember him saying at one point how many letters he wrote each year, letters of recommendation. I recall it was well into 3 digits, I think. And in my own pessimistic moments, I joked that, not that there will ever be this, but if there were a Polnaya Sobrania Sochenenia, for me, it would have 3 monographs, 3 volumes of departmental memos, and 3 volumes of recommendation letters. Ron, I think, would have at least a dozen volumes of recommendation letters alone, and twice that in number of books, let alone the many, many articles he's written. Turning now to the topic at hand, how the West wrote its history of the USSR. It's a topic, I think, that brings out the best of Ron's scholarly persona, though admittedly in quantitative terms. So Ron is a historiographer, takes only a few pages of his, what we learned, 101-page curriculum vitae. It's one that I find endlessly fascinating, but I'm also aware that we're at the last panel of a full day. One of the best pieces of academic advice I ever got, and come to think of it, this advice may actually have come from Ron himself, was never to come between academics and their meals. So I'll try here, not, as Doug Northrup said, not to overfulfill the plan. I'll start here, of course, as Alex mentioned, with his extended and thoughtful introduction to volume 3 of the Cambridge History of Russia, which he edited in 2006. That introduction was not the traditional enumeration of volume themes going methodically from one essay to the next, but something much more interesting and ambitious, a history of the history of Russia and the USSR in the West. He defined his subject capaciously, going back to perspectives on Rus from what then constituted the quote unquote West, and moving up through accounts of the Russian past written as late as the 1990s. He reveals, I think, among other things, a remarkable ability to state others' ideas, as well as his own, concisely and pithily. And I think in quantitative terms, the most stunning example of this summation is taking the 14 volumes of E.H. Carr's account of early Soviet history, something that Louis Siegelbaum mentioned this morning. It amounts to, I think, thousands, probably 3,000 pages in all. Ron's summary of it, quoting here just briefly, it was that Carr's histories told the story of a desperate and valiant attempt to go beyond bourgeois capitalism in a country where capitalism was weak, democracy absent, and the standard of living abysmally low. Throughout his essay, he strives for an admirable even-handedness. As he says at the beginning of the Soviet experiment, which I'll turn to in a minute, he's offering an attempt to deal, quote, fairly and dispassionately with a complex history, not with the vain hope of reconciling irreconcilable differences, but with the expectation that an analytic and interpretive narrative will add to our understanding. As the end of that quotation suggests, while Ron was ready to be even-handed, he's never been afraid to make his own positions clear. Before I come back to the Soviet experiment, I want to talk a little more about Ron's history of the Western history of Russia. What's so powerful about it to me upon rereading is the weaving together of 3 histories. Louis Siegelbaum talked this morning about Ron's dialectical qualities. Here, I think we're kind of aiming for trialectical, if that's even a word. And these 3 histories are as follows. Well, first is a history of the object. Russia, its 20th, especially its tumultuous 20th century history, of which he is, of course, one of the world's great experts. A second is a history of the Anglophone West, which Ron shows definitely had profound effect on history writing. And finally is a history of the academic enterprise itself. Even as Ron sees, for instance, American views of Russia as a function of Russian history and American history, he also carefully delineates a zone, not quite of autonomy, as a social historian, Ron won't put anyone, even himself, outside history, but at least of a tradition unto itself, shaped by the intellectual and, yes, political agendas they bring to their work, but also shaped by things that matter to historians, the availability of information, the coming and going of different methods from different disciplines or from within our own, the arrival of sources, and sadly departure of sources, archival among others, and I think by the experiences that came from their encounters. As Jeff Ely noted earlier, his historiographic interventions were really pushing toward critical intellectual histories. When it came to his own experiences, Ron could and did speak eloquently of them. When I was researching the book that became Know Your Enemy, I used to walk into the lobby of what was then AAA, and I used to look around me and see primary sources everywhere. But Ron here played a special role, the primary source, if you will, always edifying to talk to. He had an amazing memory of events, people, and books that were decades old. But he also had this rare ability to put himself and others into the stream of history. One thing I learned in working on that book was historians, perhaps more than anyone else, hate to be historicized. But Ron was a real exception to that rule. He didn't try to fight old battles. Instead, he wanted to think through who he was, who he had been at that time, and what animated him. And of course, I don't need to tell the audience here how wide a set of experiences he had, especially in the Soviet Union, and how well, of course, he told the stories. Ron never doubted the importance of historians, but he also never exaggerated our powers either. So when discussing the historiography of the October Revolution, Ron said that social historians did not pose the question of the revolution's legitimacy, as if, he adds bitingly, Soviet power required the sanction of academic historians. Now, Ron was ideally suited for this role of historiography. His amazing breadth of reading, his ability to express complex debates and arguments in straightforward terms, but most importantly, as I've suggested, his ability to place himself, his enterprise, and I suppose all of us into the stream of history. Ron's acted as a historiographer in other ways and on places too. In fact, rereading Toward a Social History, I wonder if it is in some ways a rehearsal for what was to come. Because when I reread the essay last week, it really struck me as one intertwines history and historiography. It offers not just a compelling case for social histories of the revolution and how they'll help us understand the era, but also an explanation of why those social histories appeared when they did. Ron was also a historiographer in the other book I've been assigned here, The Soviet Experiment, which appeared, and I have a slight gulp when I say this, it appeared about a quarter century ago. It wasn't about streams of experience, but in fact, whole rivers of history, a broad account of Russia's 20th century. It had the scope of a textbook, the apparatus of a textbook, replete with suggested readings, and unfortunately, I'd say also the price of a textbook. But it doesn't read like a textbook. In fact, in its best parts, it reads like an extended essay, moving effectively from economics to politics to culture and back again. Stalinism is the fulcrum of the book, accounting for about a third of the pages. The book devoted extensive attention to the revolution of the 1920s, I think in that sense, aptly representing the state of the field as it stood in the 1990s. The book is lively, especially in its liberal use of quotations, whether those are describing firsthand accounts of everyday Soviet life with poignancy and often humor, or whether those quotations are Politburo debates, purge trial denunciations. We really get a deep and kind of granular appreciation of the Soviet experience and the Soviet experiment from the book. It's sensible and generally even-handed. It's impressively, but I suppose unsurprisingly, weaves nationality throughout the volume. It's not just, nationality isn't just a sort of jack-in-the-box that it pops up in 1917 and again in 1989, but a kind of consistent theme. And in fact, it's integral to the interpretation and serves as an index of the nature of Soviet power. Rereading the book gave me, and I think would give all of us, far from Ann Arbor or Hyde Park, a sense of what we missed by not being able to take Ron's classes. The book also reveals in subtle ways Ron's inclinations to historiography. Instead of writing from Olympian heights like most of the broad accounts in our field, Ron makes sure that that students understand that history is told by historians. He notes when and where they agree, whether it's about the revolution, Stalinism, or much else. He inserts historians, that is us, into the text. There are constant lines. Some historians suggest, historians differ, recent historians have argued. In dozens of spots, we learn how historians work with sources to forge interpretations. And notably here, Ron is attuned to the fate of historians in Russia, including Soviet Russia, not just the historians of Russia, for reasons that are in some ways very different, but at the same time eerily similar to, kind of brings attention to our thoughts today about historians working in Russia and especially in Ukraine. The book is essentially, it introduces students to the complexity of Russian history, but in doing so, it also introduces students not just to the works of history, but to the workings of historians. So in some, while Ron's contributions as a historiographer were not necessarily, in a kind of narrow sense, as large as his contributions to social history, to Armenian studies, to the study of nationality, about which we've already heard, his account here, its contributions are really a classic Suny, thoughtful and smart, never settling to be merely clever. And it's ultimately about conversation, whether he's analyzing scholarly conversations of the past, whether he's participating in conversations of the present, or he's setting up more conversations in the future. It's worth noting finally that Ron's contributions to this scholarship, as wide-ranging as they are, were not as important, or at least to me, as his contributions to individual scholars. And that includes, I think, many, if not most of us gathered here. So in that, I'd like to wrap up and thank you.
Is this off again? How about now? Okay, I don't know how this works. Thank you, David, very much for those remarks. And I should have mentioned in my introduction that we are also considering the Soviet experiment on this panel. So in addition to the historiographical essay, we have a whole teaching angle that we can look at and talk about. And as Val said, trying to come up with all the different panels, we kind of had to mush some of them together. So for our second respondent on this panel, we have Anna Whittington, and she is a postdoctoral fellow at the Harvard University Davis Center for Russian and Eurasian Studies. Dr. Whittington is a historian of citizenship and inequality across Soviet Eurasia and a graduate of the PhD program here at the University of Michigan. Her first book manuscript, Repertoires of Citizenship, Inclusion, Inequality, and the Making of the Soviet People, explores the discourses and practices of Soviet citizenship and identity from the October Revolution to the Soviet collapse. Dr. Whittington has previously held positions at the Kennan Institute at the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C., Washington University in St. Louis, and the Higher School of Economics in Moscow. And I'm excited to announce she has recently accepted a position in the history department at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign. So congratulations, Anna.
Thank you so much for this warm introduction. And I also want to join everybody in thanking Melanie, thanking Val, Naida, the graduate students who've also put together today's panel. And of course, I especially want to thank Ron, whose work has been so influential both to the field as a whole, but also for me as an individual. All the more so because Ron's generosity as both a scholar and a person has just made him such a fantastic person to work with and to learn from. As you can all appreciate from the structure by now, as the second speaker, I'm charged with thinking about how these two works have shaped my own work. So I've organized my remarks sort of in three parts. I first want to draw on the central claims of this historiographical essay about the history of Russia and the Soviet Union in the 20th century by thinking about what it means to be historian of Russia and the Soviet Union in the 21st century. I want to use then the Soviet experiment written at the end of this 20th century to function as sort of an introductory textbook of sorts, and how that's helped me articulate what it means to write a 21st century history of the Soviet Union. And I want to close at the end by thinking a little bit about how the history of the field can help us understand what may be, in fact, be a very uncertain future of the field. So I'm going to start with the main argument of the essay, which was written, this historiographical essay, which was written in the early 2000s, less to capture the state of the field, but to account really for what had come before. This is taking stock of a century of historiography, a century during which the history of the Soviet Union, the way that we wrote the history of the Soviet Union, was shaped by the very fact of the country's existence and the passionate politics that it inspired, both in defense and in criticism of its underlying ideology. Ron's larger claims here are twofold. I think first there's the explicit one, that historians are shaped not only by their present political moment, but also more generally by the political moments that came before them. To quote the piece specifically, even those who claim to be unaffected by the battles of former generations were themselves the product of what went before. There's a secondary thread that I think goes throughout this too, that thinks about the ways in which questions of access, sources, what's available to people, has shaped the kinds of histories that scholars are able to write and explore, as well as the ways that scholars have creatively addressed both the limitations and the opportunities that are available to us. Since so many of these central claims of the piece concern the ways that historians are shaped by their larger circumstances and that of those who came before them, I thought it would be useful here to reflect on my own positionality as a historian of the Soviet Union who came of age in a distinctly post-Soviet moment. Indulge me a little, I think our discussion really begs us to be cognizant and conscious of the ways in which our own histories map onto the way that we approach the study of history. I am a product of the post-Cold War era. I can very specifically date myself. The Berlin Wall came down on the eve of what was my third birthday, and I have no memory either of that or the Soviet collapse 2 years later when I was all of 5 years old. This means for all intents and purposes, I have no real memory of the Cold War era. Soviet history, as long as I've ever been able to be aware of it, has always been, as Ron writes in the Soviet experiment, it's had a beginning, a middle, and an end. This means I came at a time where the existence of the 15 former republics, Soviet republics, was no longer as independent states, was no longer a novelty, but really a well-established reality. I first traveled to the former Soviet Union in 2007, starting as so many of us do in Russia. In my case, I spent a semester in St. Petersburg, where I interned at Memorial, the beleaguered human rights organization dedicated to documenting some of the darker histories of the Soviet Union, and it was followed by a semester in Moscow. The year also brought plenty of opportunity to travel. In addition to traveling quite extensively in provincial Russia, I spent time in Ukraine, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, travels that began to familiarize me not merely with the center of the Soviet Union, but also the complex relationships that existed across its former peripheries, which I'll say I've never really considered to be peripheral. I was struck by both the profound differences and similarities of what I observed, a revelation, or rather a series of revelations that have shaped who I am as a historian. I also came of age as a historian, that is, as a graduate student working in archives, at a moment when previously unimaginable access was rather presumed. I, of course, don't want to overstate this. There has always been and continues to be certain limitations to the topics that are accessible. Archives, too, are themselves the product of historical conditions that determined what was and was not cataloged as part of the historical record. Still, I think it's fair to say that my work as a historian has been shaped more by excess than by limitation, not least for some of the former Soviet republics, like Lithuania and Ukraine, which made notable efforts to declassify materials previously of state security that were previously unavailable to most historians. This, combined with my love for studying languages, perhaps too much love for studying languages, has really shaped the geographies of research, which in turn shape the way that we write about history, both as individuals and, of course, as a larger field. So how do these conditions shape me as a historian? I've said already, I'm really a product of the post-Cold War era, and I don't usually think of myself as particularly scarred by Cold War politics. Of course, as Ron's piece reminds me, it is impossible not to be shaped by these ideologies that pervaded our immediate pasts. For example, I've been a beneficiary of plenty of Cold War era funding models that has shaped the way that I do work. I've also learned the art of policy relevance statements and have spent no shortage of time chatting with archivists, including in non-Russian republics, as well as fellow scholars, even my own family members, my past students, and presumably some of my future ones, who remind me of the enduring legacies of Cold War reference points. I think even today you can scan Twitter for all these references of reconstituting the Soviet Union. Still, I do think it's possible to talk about the ways it is fundamentally different to be a historian of the Soviet Union now. I want to talk here about the ways the Soviet experiment, written in its first edition at the very end of the 20th century, has guided me as a historian in the 21st century, as I reflect on and take advantage of the political conditions that have shaped the field since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Specifically, I want to draw on the way that Ron sets out the goal of this book. And I quote, this is from the second edition, "This book is an attempt to recover the complexities and contradictions of the 74 years of Soviet power, its real achievements, as well as its grotesque failings." This approach, what I'm going to call today a both-and understanding of Soviet history, has been really foundational to me, both as a scholar and as an educator. And it ought to be, I think, our rallying cry as historians. The underlying message to me is that we must approach the Soviet Union on its own terms, neither demonizing nor valorizing it, but rather taking sober account of its nuances, its complexities, and its contradictions. To be clear, I don't think this is a break from the past. Indeed, as the 2006 essay reminds us, a desire to depoliticize Soviet history has long dominated strains of scholarship on the Soviet Union. If anything, I've been long struck by the generosity with which Ron writes about the history of the field, what David calls a sort of even-handedness, reading nuance into even those that he disagrees with. At the same time, I do think that the changed political circumstances over the last 30 years, though not necessarily in the future, has dramatically expanded possibilities for more nuanced interpretations and approaches. In many ways, my in-progress book manuscript, based on the dissertation that I defended here at Michigan, is a tribute to Ron's both-and approach. My title, Repertoires of Citizenship, Inclusion, Inequality, and the Making of the Soviet Union, deliberately juxtaposes inclusion and inequality to grapple with the fact that over its 70-year history, the Soviet Union both offered radical programs of inclusion for many groups that had been previously marginalized, ethnic minorities, workers, peasants, women, other groups. And it also perpetuated profound inequalities and social hierarchies. These ran the full gamut from microaggressions that shaped everyday interactions between citizens to the more extreme end of state violence. To return to the larger question of how we frame ourselves as historians operating at a specific moment in time, I want to reflect explicitly about how my approach and understandings have been shaped by politics and the material conditions of when I did research, which included, as I've said, an unprecedented level of access to archives in non-Russian republics. Being able to spend significant time in archives, not only in Moscow and to a lesser extent St. Petersburg, but also in Central Asia, in Ukraine, and shorter trips in the Baltic region, Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia. And across all these spaces, I've been able to engage with such a wide range of materials, from public-facing propaganda, legal histories, internal party discussions, educational curriculum, textbooks, and citizens' letters to authorities. For me, Ron's work has long provided a model for how to tie these disparate strands together, to see these various sites as part of a single country and as part of one larger frame of reference. Ron has challenged me to recognize the contradictions, the complexities, and the differences that existed within Soviet society, and to remember both the inclusion and inequality that were definitional to the Soviet experience. This was a country that was both culturally Russifying and which also simultaneously promoted its ethnic minorities, a country where leaders preached a message of equality for ethnic minorities while providing de facto privileges for its ethnic majority. As a text, I think the Soviet experiment invites us to consider successes and failures in the same framework. As Ron writes, again from the second edition, the Soviet achievements produced the factors that eventually led to its decline and collapse. Inspired by Ron, my work seeks to underscore the cacophony of voices and interpretations that coexisted, sometimes harmoniously, sometimes with rancor and discord, to remember that notions of Soviet identity were never singular and hegemonic. There were, of course, times where it was more so, where dissenting voices were brutally silenced and marginalized, and there was always limits on what was possible. But still, I think it's important not to interpret the lack of total freedom as a sign that there weren't freedoms at all, and that there were plenty of smaller spaces of autonomy and agency that citizens could and did claim. Indeed, I've been very impressed by the multiplicity of voices that existed even at the height of Stalinist repression, and of course, all the more so in periods of comparative liberalism, like during Perestroika. There was no single way of being Soviet, just as there is today no single way of being Russian, Ukrainian, Kazakh, or even more generally post-Soviet. I would say also there's no single way of being American. Ron reminds us of the importance of dwelling in these complexities as we excavate the many voices and individual struggles to grapple with questions of citizenship and identity. This includes both those who were championed by and those who were suppressed by leaders in Moscow. And yet somehow, all of these strands coexisted, a fact that the Soviet experience as an experiment, as an interpretive work, really effectively grapples with. As we are wont to say these days, the Soviet Union contained multitudes, and this must be a starting point for our own historical analyses. The last couple weeks have raised many interesting questions about the future of historical research. In recent years, it's easy to take the comparative ease of access for granted. While there are certainly lacunae in topics that remain difficult, which Krista Goff has discussed so eloquently in Nested Nationalism, the availability of documents, the relative ease of accessing materials from previously off-limits collections, the relaxing of visa regimes in some countries, and other conditions of relative openness have in many ways opened up the possibilities for new modes of historical inquiry. Especially exciting is the ways that the relative ease of moving through post-Soviet peripheries has shaped approaches to archival and historical work, often in ways that have made it easier to do research outside of Russia than within it, at least for those of us with US and other similar passports. I have also been struck by what a good time it has been to be a historian of the Soviet Union. The Cold War funding is always, of course, at risk of being cut, but we've lived in a time where there's been relative support and interest for doing research in non-Russian peripheries, although perhaps fewer jobs than we would all like, where access to Soviet-era documents has really changed significantly in recent years. Other things, like growing digitalization of records, far from universal, of course, present new modes of gathering documents and conducting research. There's been so much reason for optimism. These last few weeks, however, brought me to reconsider some of this optimism. Russia's escalating war in Ukraine, of course, has the potential to reshape the way that we research and write about the history of Russia and the Soviet Union. I don't want to go too much into, we've already established the difficulties of historians predicting the future, but still, the immediate shockwaves bring many reasons to be concerned. I think our biggest concern should center on the safety of everybody who's on the ground, and I don't want to minimize these very real human costs at the center of this unfolding war, but it would be naive to think that current events won't also have an impact on the ways that we study and think about history, especially the history of the Soviet Union and Russia. For one, the material situation in Ukraine is dire. Even the best case scenario, we can easily expect it to be years for collections, should they survive, to be accessible again, if at all. I also think it's pretty clear we're not even dealing with the best case scenario anymore. In Russia, new and newly reinforced laws also raise questions about the future of the past, particularly under a leader who has been eager to impose his own historical interpretation as a justification for policies of the present. Stepping away from the immediate crisis, there will also be interpretive aftershocks. What kind of histories will we write in an increasingly politicized atmosphere that is developing around us in real time? How will our own work be shaped by the increasingly pessimistic course of US-Russian relations? How will contemporary Russia's politics, particularly concerning the other territories of the former Soviet Union, shape the ways that we write the histories of the Soviet Union in the coming years, including the histories of its many peripheries, I'll add again, that were never really peripheral. So much is unknown, and of course, so much is yet to be written, including by many of us here in this room. In light of the uncertainty concerning the future of our field, I found a lot of comfort this week when I was returning to the history of its past. Ron's essay on the ways historians grappled with the history of Russia and the Soviet Union excavates the ways in which historians have always been shaped by their larger ideological and material conditions. While it's easy to lose track in the midst of the archival richness we've grown accustomed to, a look to the past reminds us that archives are not so much an end to themselves, but a tool among many in a broader quest for telling more nuanced, complex histories. And we've never had more tools at our disposal. Returning to these works, guided by Ron's expert historiographical interventions, reminds us of the comparative recentness of our present conditions. Long before the dramatic opening of the archives, historians have also often been on the forefront of creatively addressing the difficulties and limitations of our field. To be a good historian, especially one operating in a politically charged moment, has always required a degree of flexibility, nimbleness, and creativity to unpack the nuances and complexities of the past. Ron's work reminds me, and really reminds all of us, of the importance of considering both the larger ideological frameworks that shape our own interpretations, as well as the work and scholarship that come before us. Indeed, I think I can think of no better way to say it than Ron himself, so I'll end by quoting him. Looking backwards in order to understand the present and the future has become ever more imperative. Thanks.
Thank you, Anna. And we're now going to have a Q&A with Ron up here, and I will, I guess, start us off, although I think Anna kind of posed some of the questions that I wanted to frame for us, so I can just quote her in asking what kinds of histories will we write in an increasingly politicized atmosphere. And the way I was going to frame this is to think about where might we see the dividing historiographical lines, or maybe the emerging lines in the 21st century, so maybe not just at the present moment, but since, we can call it the Putin era, starting in 2000, how is the West writing or rewriting its history of Russia today? And what would a critical intellectual history, to use the phrase that Jeff used and then that David quoted, what would that kind of critical intellectual history or critical historiography of the present moment start to look like? Where would we perhaps begin such an analysis? And I particularly I'm struck by rereading that historiographical essay, the impact that other disciplines, and particularly political scientists, had on setting the agenda for historians and really defining the field as we know it today, and and as well as journalists and travelers' accounts and all these other ways of writing about Russia. So I'm wondering if that's a place that we should again look at as setting an agenda for historians, or are we setting the agenda more than we were, in the mid-century for how the public is thinking about Russia, or what can we do to assert ourselves more, if that is what we should do? And then maybe just as a question that can combine the two texts, what's your approach to incorporating historiography into your teaching? Your textbook does it so well, but maybe if not working with a source that does it itself, how do we, how much should we include that in courses where we're teaching students about this stuff?
Sorry, should I jump in? I wasn't sure.
Go for it, David.
Alex, yeah. I mean, I think they're all really good questions. I think one thing that has been of recent interest, and sadly, tragically, will be, I think, even more, is in directions for the field is Russia's historical international power, its power both near and far. And I think we've seen some accounts of that in the Soviet era, and I think we'll revisit that in interesting ways that go beyond the kind of traditional foreign relations approach. We've seen that in the imperial era, and we see that even a little, and we'll see much more in the kind of post-Soviet Russia. And another, I think, is one, as Anna indicated, the Cold War bequeathed many things, including some funding sources that were generous, but came with their own limitations. But I think it tended to lock the field into a sense of Soviet Union sui generis. And I think one of the things that's been really enriching the field since 1991, I think will continue to do so even more, is to look at Russia in broader European, Eurasian, Asian contexts that don't assume the uniqueness any more than historians think of every national experience as unique. So those are two ways. I don't know if they constitute dividing lines, but two directions I think that the field is going in and will continue to do even more. I think that's where I'll stop for here.
I mean, there are so many questions here, and I know that we are eager to get to our dinner eventually too, so I want to just be brief and have time for more questions before so. But I want to think a little bit, since David has answered some of these already, thinking about how we're setting the agenda. And I think one of the things that I've been really heartened by, though I think there's always room for more, is the ways in which some historians are stepping up to talk and tell more complex histories. But I'm also struck by the sort of structural difficulties of trying to be part and trying to inform the conversation as historians, especially when your general mode of operating is always towards more nuance, more complexity. It's not that simple. A friend was talking to me about fact-checking about what relations were like between Russia and Belarus and Ukraine before 1991. And I don't know how to start with when the questions are so uninformed by the history. I think that there's a lot to be said about the ways in which historians have a real responsibility for thinking about these historic, the ways historic processes are shaping the present and continue to shape the present to this day. And I think in terms of teaching and historiography, I think, to me, so many of these goals that Ron outlines in the Soviet experiment, they really resonate with me, this idea of trying to understand the Soviet Union on its own terms, trying to think about these sort of complexities that existed within, and moving students away from simplistic frameworks of everything was bad or everything was great and we should emulate this. And I think recovering the nuance and sitting in the complexities is part of the most important thing that we do as both as scholars and as educators.
Those are very good answers. I would add one thing. I think the history of Russia and the Soviet Union is in very good shape today. Let's say up to February 24th, 2022. The production of works, the quality of works that I've been reading, I'm reading in different places around the world and so forth, is extraordinary. And it's a very high quality. And in some ways, and this follows, I think, what Anna was saying in a way, the post-Soviet historiography did not have to fight some of the engaged fights that we were fighting or thought we had to fight in the Soviet times, right? And that may have liberated in some ways. There are disadvantages to the new Soviet historiography in that you've never been to the Soviet Union. Soviet Union is like Rome, ancient Rome. And there was something about living there, as difficult as it was, many of us can attest to, that was also fantastic. Actually, people read books, on the subway. They knew more American literature than I knew. I mean, there were amazing things. And life was difficult, and it was real in a way. There are all kinds of incredible things. I mean, I'm soft on the Soviet Union. I loved it there. I had a love there. No, I shouldn't go into that. There were many experiences that were so genuine and so amazing to me. And I had friends who are now, I'm losing one by one in recent years, but all of that stuff. That's one thing. The second thing I would say is as we move away from that experience and we look back, it's going to be difficult to capture some of those things. But I've been talking to Albert and others, Alex, other students, Rennie, and looking at the historiography of the post-Stalin period. It's fantastic. The depth of it, the nuance, the texture is extraordinary. And there's a way in which our generation spent too much time on the revolution and on Stalinism. Stalinism became the main example of what the Soviet Union was about. The Soviet Union collapsed, and the big industry was the Gulag. Now, we're getting beyond the Gulag. We're now, because the Gulag, many people don't know this, basically ended with the death of Stalin. By 1956, most of these people had been liberated. You went from 2.7 million to about 150,000 prisoners, right? So something fundamental happened. Actually, people don't know that out there, but okay. The terror ended, and something happened, and for the next 30, 40 years, there was another kind of state. It was still a police state. It was still a one-party state. It was still authoritarian, but life was going on in ways. Private life was developing, and that's being written about, and the stuff is fantastic, you know, the stuff's coming out. But as we move away from the Soviet experience, it will still become, in the public sphere, a useful target as the negative or black, let's say, distorted mirror of how wonderful bourgeois democracy is and capitalism is, right? So it serves a very important ideological purpose. And Soviet historians will have the task to try to show, you know, in what ways this works and what way it doesn't work. One of the interesting developments in Soviet historiography was the development of the idea of Soviet subjectivity. That is, the way Soviets were not the kind of quintessential liberal subject who all had, you know, individualism, their own self-interest, et cetera, in mind. And that also, it seems to me, is something we should try to investigate deeper as we go forward.
Hi, thank you very much for a wonderful panel and really for a wonderful 2 days. I have learned a great deal. I hope that this will go on to be published in one way or another, either as an edited collection or a special issue of a journal, because there have been so many good things that have been expressed. I have a concern, and it comes from the fact that I was born and raised in Cuba, and I write about Cuba and do research on it. And that is that in 2 days, I haven't heard anybody say anything about Cuba. And you could not write the history of the Cuban Revolution without talking about the Soviet Union, now Russia. And it's odd to me that you can talk about the history of the Soviet Union without talking about Cuba. It must have played some significant role, although of course much smaller than the one that it plays in the island. I am now in the midst of this Ukrainian invasion, of course, very concerned for the Ukrainian people, but I am particularly worried about how easily it could derail into something that could end up close to what we lived through during the 1962 October missile crisis, when the, you know, peak moment of the Cold War almost brought us to the brink of nuclear war, and Cuba was in the middle between the United States and the Soviet Union. What is in the middle now between the United States, the Western European countries, NATO, and the Soviet Union is Cuba and Venezuela. And I am genuinely worried about it, and I have reason to be worried about it. I'm not somebody that is usually anxious about the future, but I take things one step at a time. But for example, this last week, Putin already sent a Russian ship full of oil to Cuba, which disembarked in Cienfuegos, and nobody's very sure of whether it was intended for Cuba, which in itself, I mean, I should backtrack and say that Cuba's new president, Miguel Díaz-Canel, has already offered his support in many, many ways for Russia in this Ukrainian struggle. Okay, so that's there already. So we don't know if this ship landed in Cuba because it's bringing oil to Cuba for whatever purposes, or whether it was free floating in the Caribbean because nobody wants to buy Putin's oil at this moment in time. But there is a story that I haven't heard from you guys, and that I think is a part, an important part of Soviet history. That's what I would say.
I remember the Cuban Missile Crisis
Yes, I'm sure you
very
do.
well, you know, and I remember I had a wonderful girlfriend at the time who was still at Swarthmore College, and I was already a graduate student at Columbia, and she called up in a panic. And of course, being who I am, I said, don't worry about it. Khrushchev won't launch missiles and we'll be in fine shape. That time I was right. So I was a little bit futuristic at that time. Yeah, I think that obviously if we're studying Soviet history, at a certain point we're going to deal with the relations with Cuba, the way in which the Soviets supported the Cuban Revolution outside of Cuba, in Africa, and so on. Those are important questions. At the moment, you know, attention goes in certain directions.
Yes,
and right now, all the focus is on this thing. The thing is, in 1962, we averted nuclear war. Other crises have occurred, like, let's say, 9/11. I remember 9/11. Many of you remember 9/11. And there was panic in 9/11. America had been attacked. And I was trying to say to people, I was at Stanford at the time, this is not that big a deal. It's because these are terrorists. It's a small group. They got very lucky, and they don't have nuclear weapons or anything. I didn't realize that we were then going to go to war forever in Afghanistan. This is a different crisis. This could become something so serious between NATO and Russia, the United States, one nuclear power and another nuclear power. And that's what I think we have to worry about. And what I don't see yet, and I can't imagine, and I heard Yuri Zhukov, our wonderful colleague yesterday, talk about the possible futures. I don't see an off-ramp. I don't see a way we can negotiate ourselves out of this. Putin doesn't want to lose and won't allow himself to lose. And there's a way in which, this is a terrible thing to say, that Ukrainians will be expendable in a way, if in fact both sides deem it necessary to back off and and avoid nuclear war. That's what is very fearful. But it could escalate into something really terrible. Let's hope not.
David, would you like to comment on this question? Or?
I mean, the only thing I'd say is I actually had this sort of work in mind. I think of Ann Gorsuch's work on the kind of ideological work of Cuba in the Soviet Union. And when I think about international power near and far, it extends certainly to places like Cuba. It also extends in ways that involve what we would now call soft power and the kind of cultural, political attractions that the Soviet Union had across what we used to call the global South, as well as a kind of sustained and still current military connections as well. So I do think that that's something that is getting some attention. It didn't get that much here because in all of Ron's 101-page CV, I'm not sure there's much about Cuba in it, and he gave us enough to talk about. We didn't need more, but I do see that as sort of incorporated in the comments I made.
I'll just add really quickly here that I think part of the absence has a lot to do with the hierarchies of power and the ways in which that's sort of diffused across empire, and also, to echo David, the specific interests of the people who are here. But I do think one of the really important ongoing historiographical changes that we're seeing is a real change in the ways that we think of the geographies of Soviet space, including Soviet relations with the external world. So I think that's a conversation that is taking place, perhaps just not in this room.
Forrest, go ahead.
Hi, so I had the privilege of being an undergraduate in a Soviet history class where we read The Soviet Experiment. And that was my first introduction to Ron and Ron's work before I met him in real life, of course. And I can't describe just how electrifying it was to read this book. I mean, this was probably 2013, not that long before Crimea, actually. And, I think it gave me tools to think critically about liberalism in a way I never had before. And this kind of portrayal of Lenin that's critical but also sympathetic, I found really just sort of a different perspective. And it wasn't just me. There was another student in the class, a kind of dour anarchist kid who at some point he kind of slammed his fist on the table and said, "I just don't get it. There's so much oppression. Why aren't we rising up like they did?" And so I guess this is a question about, and I'm sure that this is something that's in flux given recent events, but as you all, I'm curious actually from everyone on the panel, as you formulate your Soviet history classes, what kinds of things do you want students to take away from those classes? I mean, what are the kind of key questions that you see as pedagogically most important in this material?
I think I said before that I see history always as a critical and subversive study. And the wonderful thing that we do as historians, knowing the past, and anthropologists and sociologists would also be in the same camp, we know that people live differently, and we know that people think differently, and that there are other possibilities of human society. And that's very important. So you can study the Soviet Union with all its flaws and all its grotesqueries, and still appreciate that there was another way that people were organizing themselves and thought and had aspirations to make a better world. I do think Lenin was genuinely a person, and many early Bolsheviks were genuinely people who wanted to make Russia better in some way. And they hoped there'd be an international revolution. They didn't get that. They had to do it on their own, and other things happened. Stalin came to power. Stalin himself had aspirations, his own vision. Stalin's vision to me is a right-wing vision, not a left-wing vision. It was about the darker sides of human nature. It used coercion, and there were a number of other things. So it's a complicated history. I would like people to appreciate that history more. And I want to have, if I can just take a moment, we only have a few minutes here, but to say something. I often ask my students after they've read the Soviet experiment, what do you think the dominant emotion is in this book? And I'm very interested in emotions, right? We haven't had a chance to talk that much about it, but it's very important. The interest in emotions came from the years in exile in Chicago. So I was in a political science department, and the dominant modality and a form of analysis is rational choice theory. And people are rational, and they make decisions on the basis of, this is the way they put it, maximizing their utilities. So it comes out of economics, it's homo economicus. And I thought to myself, this is the most desiccated way to try to understand human nature. What about all these other things that we do? And there are literally people like Gary Becker, a great Nobel Prize-winning economist, who said love and marriage can be explained as a rational choice, right? To maximize the species or whatever. And so I thought, no, this is impossible. And I began to teach a course at Chicago. Chicago, you could do whatever you wanted. In emotions, in politics and emotions. And I learned a lot, and I investigated. So that's how I developed this idea of affective dispositions, that people don't act only rationally. Their own rational arguments are based on emotional preferences and emotional dispositions. So it's a kind of bounded rationality, right? We have those theories. So what's the dominant motion then in the Soviet experiment? Maybe it's nostalgia? Well, that's not so good. The dominant emotion, and this will explain a lot about what we've been discussing today, is regret. Regret that it didn't work out, that they made this revolution and they had a promise of something that would go beyond capitalism, namely socialism, and they blew it. And it wasn't the place to make socialism. It was a society that needed yet to develop bourgeois society and liberal understandings before they could then move on, if you take a kind of strictly Marxist teleology. So I thought that was a very powerful way to explain why I still love and the Soviet Union, especially the people who were living there, but I also have this terrible regret that they suffered so much in trying to do a thing that I think was probably in many ways impossible given the circumstances of the 20th century.
David or Anna, would you like to respond on the?
Ron, your last comment makes me think, and I'm not sure how you'll take this, but I think of Martin Melia's line that socialist Russia was impossible and they built it. As part of it, I would have said, actually, when you said it was regret, I would have said chastened hope, because you always have this optimism about you, and yet you understand the world and its its limits and certainly the failings. One of the things I take from your work more generally, and I think this came to answer the question more directly, is the importance of empathy, of understanding the perspective of the historical subjects you write, but at the same time not being limited to those perspectives. That understanding where they were coming from is crucial to any historical interpretation, and yet it's too easy to kind of let those historical understandings rule. And I think the power in your work is something that you exhibit in the halls of the conferences as well as in your work, which is this sense of empathy to really understand what these folks thought they were doing, even if you'll then go on to look at it critically as you do.
I think I would add too that for me, one of the things that's really important to convey is the sort of difference of the Soviet experience, both across time and space. To remember that there wasn't a single Soviet experience that was shared by all citizens, but rather that every citizen understood their own lives in their own particular ways. I think when teaching Soviet history, of course, it's very important that people get larger senses of the timelines to understand, but only really as a means for understanding this sort of complexity of experience across time and space. And I think that's one of the things I really like about the Soviet experiment is that it covers so much, there's like so much nuance and complexity that's contained within, and it provides a lot of different mirrors for understanding not the Soviet experience as a unitary defined thing, but rather the many experiences that collectively defined it.
I'm going to add one more thing, and I want to thank everyone for, let me thank first, and then I'll tell you my one more thing. I want to thank everybody here, all the panelists, and Val, and Melanie, and Naida, and the graduate students. This has been amazing. And I was a little embarrassed, you know, yesterday when I was thinking what was going to happen. Can they really sustain talking about me for a whole day? And you did. And I think that's extraordinary, and I don't think it was that easy. So thank you for doing all of that. And I want to just try one more answer to Forrest's question. There are big divides in Soviet historiography, and this is what this panel was about. And one was Stalin inevitable after Lenin? Was Stalin the outgrowth of Leninism and Marxism, and therefore, from Martin Mally's point of view, it's a Soviet tragedy, nothing could have come out of it. There's a kind of ideocratic understanding, and you can find it in people today. Stephen Kotkin is one who will argue that way, okay? And that's a powerful explanatory narrative that can go on. And then there was this, there's another one that no, Leninism was very different from Stalinism. It certainly grew out of Leninism, but as Trotsky put it, a river of blood separates Lenin and Stalin. There are, I would add one more big story that we tell in our thing, and one is that there was some kind of blueprint, whether it was Marxism or Leninism, that was worked out in Soviet history, and it was doomed from beginning to end. Obrechina, it was doomed. The one I subscribe to, and it's again Moshe Levin, you know, is the Soviet experiment was a series of improvisations. They were trying, Anna just said this in a way, they were trying different things. There was no blueprint. Marx was no help. He didn't write more than a page and a half about what socialism would be. He wrote all about capitalism, got it pretty right. But he didn't write about socialism. And so they started, and they made a revolution, and they tried state capitalism for about a year and a half. That didn't work, everything collapsed. They tried what we call now war communism. That didn't work, the war was over. They tried the new economic policy, Stalinism, 5-year plans. Then they tried to get rid of those things. And finally, they started Gorbachev's perestroika and glasnost. And this radical revolution, which was supposed to change everything very rapidly without keeping the state intact, of course, caused the collapse of that state. So it seems to me that's a really fruitful way, and that maybe I would teach, that people were trying different things. They never quite got it right, and ultimately it disappeared. Maybe that's something. And again, out of that, I must say, I have this regret that somehow none of these experiments worked. Thanks a lot.
With that, I think we should probably wrap it up since we're 5 minutes over. So I'm sorry we didn't get to more questions, but we will have time after this and at dinner. So let's maybe give one more round of applause for everyone who presented and spoke today, to the organizers, and most of all to Ron.